Wonderful. So thank you very much for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be the first scholar opening this economics seminar, this special here. And it's not the first time I'm presenting my work at the new school, which I consider to be my home when in New York. So thank you very much. This is the book. You can see here it is, my hard copy. So let's go straight to the point. What is this? I'm going to set my timer. What is this book for? So I'm a historian of economics. So I've been dealing with this subject for years now. So at a certain point, I made up my mind and say, okay, why don't you write a book on what we talk about when we talk about the relation between gender issues and political economy and economics. So this is a history of this subject. And I would like to stress the fact that it's an interpretation, a history, not the history of. And when we talk about the relationship between gender issues and economics, we are talking about, especially now, with the so-called gender inequality or inequalities, either in the economy or in economic matters, including within the discipline. So which are these gender inequalities? You can see in the slide, there is a list, a very general list. We talk about inequalities in labor gap, in a wage gap, and related with these two, which are connected, of course, the phenomena of the so-called pink ghettos and glass ceiling, pink ghettos, the sectors where most female workers are working. And glass ceiling is the very hard situation, the difficulties to get an upgrading for female workers, for women. And talking about economics and economic matters, we can also have inequalities in the number of female entrepreneurs. And or we can see a difference in quality about talking about entrepreneurs, portfolio versus serial, and we have different situations if we are talking about developing countries versus developed countries. Another topic is the discussion about the nature and neglected recognition of care work versus the wage work, taking for granted that historically and traditionally care works is a burden mainly to women. And of course, all these gender inequalities in economy are related with the so-called gender educational gap, with the observation that gender educational gap is the only gender gap in favor of women. But still, in spite of this, we have inequalities in all the other issues. So this is very important. So in order to study and to analyze all these equalities, there are, within economic theory, there are two possible approaches. The first one is called, and it's well known, feminist economics. The other one is called gender and economics. In this book, I'm labeling gender economics by adding the adjective neoclassical, so gender neoclassical economics. So this is the book of the history of these two different approaches to study, to deal with gender issues within economic theory. These two approaches add a long story, and this is precisely the subject of the book. They might converge in understanding and possibly overcoming, of course, gender gaps, the gender gaps previously mentioned, but they are very different because they will see better in the presentation. They adopt different methodological and theoretical approach, being the gender economics and neoclassical mainstream economic theory, while feminist economics has been presented itself as an heterodox approach that rejects neoclassical economics. Also, they diverge in considering a different benchmark as the final result of economics. Being gender neoclassical economics much more focused on efficiency, while feminist economics is much more focused on fairness. And then we can say that when they both try to inquire the origin of these gender inequalities. Feminist economics is adopting a much more cultural explanation, while some neoclassical economics, gender neoclassical economics, adopts some biological explanation. So these are in a very broad framework the main differences between these two approaches to gender issues within economic theory. So in this book, this book is basically divided into two parts. The first part, the first two chapters are devoted with the historical origin of feminist economics and gender neoclassical economics. And the second part is more oriented to the present situation and try to explain their differences. So in particular, in the historical part of the book, I try to point out that this story begins, we can say that this story begins in 19th century. And of course, in 19th century, we don't talk about feminist economics or gender neoclassical economics. When we talk about gender issues within political economics, at that time, we were talking about the so-called woman question. The woman question was a set of problems which can be summed up as the following: which is the role of women in families and society, and why, and what is the origin of this subjection of women, which is one of the main arguments for people interested in this subject. In this book, I try to show that the role of political economy was determinant in the progression of the so-called women empowerment. Because it's very easy, it's very common to think about the woman question, also called first wave of feminism or early feminism, as an effect of the political battle for suffrage. But this came later. I mean, the political movement to get suffrage for women started at the very end of the 19th century. Before that, other battles were taken by women, and political and introduced the role of women, introduced a women question within political economy was one of the first one. What does it mean to introduce women question within political economy? There are several examples, but for example, during the 19th century, there was a huge debate, and we are going to get in further details later. There was a huge debate on what happens when women enter the job market. So what happens to men, to other workers? What happens to wage? this was a very important debate because that was the first time in history that women finally went outside the household and to get a job. I'm not talking about, of course, labor class women. I'm talking about middle class women, because labor class women, they were used to go to job market or to join labor force because they were forced to do that. But we are talking about middle class or middle upper class women who finally decided to join labor force. So when this happened in the 19th century, what was the economic consequence, and what the discipline try to explain the consequences of these entering of women in labor force. Another very important fact that happens in late 19th century, early 12th century, was that finally women economists and women in general, women scholars, enter in academia, including in the economics department. That was very important because many of them were engaged in talking about women question within political economy. Many of them were not involved in women question, but still they entered academia. So that was important. The story goes on up to the distinction, the official distinction between feminist economics and gender neoclassical economics, which happened in the second half of the 12th century. And as I told you before, the second part of the book is dealing specifically with their differences and similarities. So let's try to get some more details about the connection between the so-called woman question and political economy in 19th century. Of course, the first battle for the equality between sexes started during the Enlightenment with the well-known names that are listed in the first lines of this slide. So de Gouges in France, Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill later in the UK. The first battle for women was, as I told you before, not political. The first battle to get equality between sexes was education. So the possibility to enter to academia. That was a long battle that started at the very beginning of the 19th century and ended up only after First World War. Only after First World War, women were allowed to enter to academia in basically any school. So that was a huge battle. Then, of course, there was the battle to get the same legal rights as men, and then the battle to get the same economic role. If you get legal rights, you can own, for example, a firm, and then to be independent from an economic point of view. The political side of the story came later, came at the end of the century. In this story, it's very important to understand that cultural elements such as the role of religion and the consciousness of being a minority were fundamental. For example, Jewishness was a key element in German-speaking countries during this battle for emancipation of women. Quakerism, as well as abolitionism in the US, was another cultural element that was essential for people engaged in this battle. Another element that is important in this story, which is part of the framework, is the role of social transformation during the second industrial revolution, or during the so-called progressive age or progressive era in the United States. And another point is that classical liberalism and socialism were both fundamental to understand this part of the story, with a caveat. Usually we are used to connect feminism with socialism. That was not precisely true in the 19th century, because the first feminist stance came from classical liberalism. Socialism, the social tradition, became careful with about women question just late, definitely later, because in the socialist tradition, I'm not making distinction between the several, let's say, souls or sides of the socialist tradition. In the socialist tradition, in socialism, the battle was between, as you know, classes. So gender was not an issue. For Luxembourg, for example, gender was not an issue, differently from Clara Zetkin, for example, which was her mentor and lifetime friends. Anyhow, so this is the, let's say, general cultural framework that we have to keep in mind when we talk about women question within political economy. So let's try to give some examples. What I'm talking about when I talk about the fact that women question enters within political economy. The first element is that some women, well-known women like Jane Marcet and Harriet Martineau, were engaged in give some popularization of political economy, of course, of the classical school, given the time they were working and living. And so they both promoted a pre-market education for girls in order to get girls emancipated from their husbands, brothers, and fathers, and so forth. And of course, they were following Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus with some differentiation, of course. There was, as I told you, a huge debate in the second half of 19th century about the sexual division of labor, which involved founding fathers of political economy or marginalism, like Jevons and Marshall. They both claimed that there was no need of gender equality in labor market. Jevons claimed that workplaces and work hours should be differentiated according to class, race, and gender, and recommended that married women and mothers, they recommend them to stay at home, for example. And Alfred Marshall argued that women have different mental attitudes, so they were asked they should stay at home because of their different mental attitudes, but also because their fundamental role in society was to be wives and mothers. Of course, against Jevons and Marshall, there were John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill, who by chance was his wife. Another huge debate was on women at work and involved gender wage gap. So that was a debate on gender labor gap, but there was also a huge debate on gender wage gap. Barbara Bodichon, for example, supported and strongly fought for equal gender wage by introducing the principle that women and men were equal there's no different mental attitudes, so they can be both you know, greed, and they can be both cooperative, and they can be both competitive, and so forth. And she pointed out that the surplus of women workers drove down their wages only because of rules and habits and customs and laws, not because of their natural attitude. So these arguments were later developed in the discipline, but they were rooted in that first phase of the debate. Again, there was a huge debate on the Economic Journal between Sidney Webb and Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Sidney Webb, by the way, was one of the most influential socialist scholar in the UK, and he was also one of the founder of the London School of Economics. And that debate was on gender wage gap. Basically, Webb maintained that women were inferior in terms of quality and quantity, so pink ghettos and glass ceiling were justified. What we call now pink ghettos and glass ceiling. Of course, Fawcett replied that women lower performance was not deniable, but because it was the job market that relegates women to low-wage jobs by creating de facto a sort of occupational segregation. So these are some examples of the debate about women question and political economy in 19th century. As I told you before, meanwhile, the women questions within political economy enters in academia, because women economists finally had the chance to become professors, to join faculties. Well, most of them, 90% of them, were so-called adjunct professors. So, but some of them became faculties. This happened at the very beginning in the United States. We must say that in 1886, the American Economic Association, which was relatively new, was held an essay competition, held several essay competition, annual essay competition on women issues. That was important. That was important because it gave the chance to talk about this problem in an academic environment. Another important element was the publication in 1898 by Perkin Gilman of her book, which was a bestseller, let's say so, Women and Economics, to promote gender equality in the job market. And in the same time, we must remember the increasing role also of female entrepreneurs, especially in the United States. And this is very important because the highest percentage of female entrepreneurs in the United States in that period were African Americans. So a double condition of being a minority, women, to be a woman and to be Afro-American. So that was important. At the end of this story, what does it mean that women enters to academia? They became professors, but not only they became professors, but two different research fields emerged. The first research field was home economics at the very beginning of the 12th century, and during interwar, another research field emerged that was household economics. Home economics was a sort of scientific management of household for good wives and mothers. Women must be educated in order to build up strong families, and strong families were able to build up a strong society. So it's a kind of organicistic view, which was very important in that specific historical period. Why this is important? Because the home economics departments were settled, and they were the departments where women economists get a position. So it's a kind of, you know, double, home economics departments had a double nature, because they became at the same time an opportunity for women to get an academic position, but they also became a niche for women professors, because there were economics department and now home economics department. So if you were a woman, you get a position at the university, but you would be probably kindly asked to join home economics department and stay and let economics department to male colleagues. But still, that was important because it's better than nothing. After the war, so during interwar, in Chicago, we have the emergence of the so-called household economics by Talbot, Kirk, Reed, and Hoyt. They tried to free home economics by all these, let's say, all these aspects of management of the household. They try to build up a theory of household, an economic theory of household. So they introduced the idea that economic analysis of all decision makers within a family that concern consumption, savings, and allocation of time in labor or leisure must become a research field. There are some differences among them, of course. Here there are just a couple of specifications. For example, Kirk was very focused on welfare economics, and she intended the welfare economics as a way of taking account of both inefficiency and unfairness, so or both efficiency and fairness. While Margaret Reed was much more concerned in the condition of women who carry on the unpaid labor within households. So you can see that those are very modern arguments that was presented to the audience during that time. What happened after during the 60s and the 70s? That's the beginning of the story of the divergence between what I called feminist economics and gender neoclassical economics. And this happened during the so-called second wave of feminism. Of course, we are all aware of the fact that at the end of the 60s, there was a general cultural revolution and sexual liberation and so forth. And that involved any discipline, that involved press, literature, everything. In this, the cultural revolution, the idea that man's dominance had been perpetually ruled society in any social, cultural, economic, and political sphere became an argument. The idea, I mean, this is a huge argument, of course, here can just be listed something. One of the most important idea was that the differences between sexes have determined differences in gender social roles. Either within private or public life. So gender social roles were socially and culturally determined, not biologically determined. In academia, what happened? What did happen in academia during this period? The so-called women's studies emerged. Women's studies are the study of a social status and the study of contributions of women, which were often neglected in society and in all other cultural fields. Women's studies were focused on analyzing the relationship between power and gender by pointing out that power was gendered. And women's studies were shaped, curricula of women's studies were shaped around interdisciplinarity. So typical women question issues such as reproduction, marriage, family, divorce were scrutinized through psychology, anthropology, literature, and also economic theory, economics. For example, Sen at Harvard introduced a course on economic distribution by considering the role of families, which is not only a potential source of love, but can be also a place where violence emerge, and especially against women and children that can be whom can be abused either physically or psychologically. And Sen also pointed out that the GDP was not calculated by taking account of the specific contribution of women. So the emergence of this second wave of feminists and the emergence within academia of women's studies with their own curricula, with their own departments and so forth, was determinant even in economics. So given this cultural background, feminist economics emerged, and emerged also the so-called new home economics. New home, I'm considering feminist economics even here, even though feminist economics officially didn't exist in the 70s. Officially means it was not yet a research field, but it will be, as an application of women's studies within economic theory, with the purpose of radically change the nature of economic theory itself. It was also an application of the so-called feminist philosophy to political economy in order to expose gender bias in economic models, which ignore the separate identities within among family members, and underestimate non-economic factors. So feminist economics emerged in this period as a possible and radical revision of the discipline as a whole. Meanwhile, Becker and Mincer, between 70s and 80s, created, let's say so, the so-called new home economics. So they tried to, they took household economics. I don't know why they didn't label their own research field as new household economics. They choose new home economics. I have no idea why, because it's much more related with household economics. But if you remember some contribution of household economics, they were concerned with fairness and so forth. Nothing at all for Becker and Mincer. They started with household economics, and they considered fertility, marriage, divorce, mate selection, childhood support, as well as macroeconomics elements they analyzed all these topics by adopting a neoclassical model, neoclassical instruments. What this means that they consider the specialization of in households, namely the division of labor between men and women, namely men outside in job market and women within the household taking care of children, as a direct consequence of their own theory of human capital. So they consider that division of labor as natural due to the biological differences between male and females, between men and women. And doing that, so it considered that gender inequality, the several gender inequalities as efficient. In doing that, Becker implicitly adopted the methodological assumption according to which the utility function, the expected utility function of the household was the same, so equals the head of the family. And the head of the family for Becker was the father, but the father was considered altruistic and fair, which is of course not always the case. So besides being, let's say, there is a problem of realism of a methodological, initial methodological assumption in this Becker model. What did happen officially within the discipline? There is a timeline here. The blue is for feminist economics, the green is for what I call gender neoclassical economics, which is the development of a new home economics a la Becker and Minzer. 1971, women's studies programs were established. The first program was Wichita at Harvard. Then they were developed everywhere worldwide. In the same year, the American Economic Association created the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession to monitor the progress of women economists within academic departments and to reduce gender gap in the profession. This committee, of course, is still working, and every year they wrote an annual report about that. At a certain point, the American Economic Association created the so-called GEL code. The GEL codes are very important because they establish research fields. So they give scholars, economists, a place to stay. So in 1919, household economics got its official GEL code, D1. And as a subfield, new home economics, a la Becker, got the GEL code D13. While gender economics got another GEL code, J16. J, because J is is the macro code for labor economics. So gender economics and new home economics were basically the same. So neoclassical approach, they were adopting neoclassical approach, but gender economics was much more specifically for labor theory. Feminist economists, meanwhile, didn't like that much the fact that they don't have any GEL code, because they consider themselves very far from both new home economics and gender economics. So after a huge internal and external debate, in 1992, feminist economists who rejected both new home economics and gender economics founded the International Association of Feminist Economics. And 3 years later, they started to publish their own academic journal, Feminist Economics. Finally, in 2006, Feminist Economics got its official GEL code, B54. B is the macro GEL code for heterodox economics. So at the end of the story, after almost 15 years, feminist economists decided that at the moment they got finally a GEL code, so they got finally a official recognition among economists, they consider themselves as an heterodox approach. Today, gender neoclassical economics has been labeled as economics of gender. This is a very recent change. This is important because this is the story of the recognition of both approach within the discipline. I have 5 minutes left, if I'm not wrong, right? Okay, so which is the nature of feminist economics? It should be easy to understand, given that given what I just told, that feminist economics rejected to adopt neoclassical economics to explain gender inequalities. Because neoclassical economics, according to feminist economists, is not only mainstream, but it's also male-stream. So it's based on an idea of considering human behavior as driven by male motivations, competition, efficiency, and so forth. Feminist economists claimed that this androcentric perspective makes economic theory biased. So they wanted to completely change the nature of economics. Their aim, among these, the aims of feminist economics, there is the incorporation of caring and unpaid labor, the analysis of power relations within economic theory, the inclusion of ethics and values, and the importance of considering differences by class, race, and ethnicity, and other factors, of course, including gender. So that's why feminist economists, after a huge debate, decided to label themselves as heterodox. On the other side, gender neoclassical economics, as I told you before, when I was talking about Becker's, claim that the division of labor within households depends on biological differences, that the allocation of women times in households and men times in market is rational, and that gender wage gap is a natural consequence of this specific division of labor between them. Gender neoclassical economics makes implicit also some patriarchal assumptions, as that marriage is seen as a long-term commitment to assure women to be protected, specialized market-oriented investments on boys are better than on girls, while girls should be educated to become more household oriented, and so forth. I must say that the recent developments in gender neoclassical economics are aware of these problems, of these methodological problems, and they introduce some I'm not saying feminist, but some different perspective, like the introduction of social norms on gender roles and the difference between among family members. Anyhow, for several decades, feminist economics and gender neoclassical economics or economics of the gender were antagonists, were in opposition. I like to quote Barbara Bergmann, who was one of the most important feminist economists, and she claimed that the new home economics economists are not feminists. To say that the new home economists are not feminist in their orientation would be as much of an understatement as to say that the Bengal tigers are not vegetarian, of course, because Bergmann, with this sentence, Bergmann was claiming that, of course, feminist economics is different from gender neoclassical economics. It's not a matter of talking about that. There's nothing to think about that. I don't have time probably to be, because the time is over, but to give you an example, a more specific example of the divergence between the two approaches. I'm just mentioning it, rationality. This is important because, very quick, gender neoclassical economics has adopted a so-called Cartesian notion of rationality. Based on the division of body and mind, being mind the male part, the rational part, the competitive part, while body is the part of human nature related with passions, sentiments, emotions, and so forth. And of course, the rational part is much better and is supposed to rule the society, to rule the world. On the other side, feminist economics, feminist philosophers and feminist economics who adopt this feminist philosophy reject this dichotomy. And there are three different positions. The classical vision, women are able to follow ideas of standard rationality. The different voices, standard rationality is incomplete and must be modified, or the strong critical stance. Standard rationality must be rejected because of its methodological fallacy. And I'm claiming that at least at the beginning of this story of the split between the two approaches, feminist economics definitely was following the third stance. This is important. This idea, this example of rationality is important because this gives some connection between feminist economics and other heterodox approaches. In the book, there is a part about that, because the critique of the notion of rationality adopted by neoclassical economics is one of the leitmotifs among many heterodox approaches. So if there is a point in common between heterodox approach is the critique against the notion of rationality adopted by neoclassicals. For example, feminist economics, even those politically oriented towards the left, they are criticizing this notion of rationality, as well as Austrian economics, which is not oriented towards left, of course. So this is important in the narrative of the story about possible connection between feminist economics and gender neoclassical economics, or economics of gender as it is called today. And what is happening today? There is a long quotation by Jacobson. There is a kind of convergence between the two approaches. So things are changing. For example, in the journal Feminist Economics, many articles by economists of the gender, by neoclassical economists, are hosted lately, in the last 10 years, we can say so. If this is true, it will be important to explain why this convergence is happening. But this is another story. So this is probably related with the difficulties for heterodox approaches to get tenure positions, for example, in academia, within academia, or because feminism in general is no longer on the top of the agenda in civil society, for example. So there are many possible explanations, but as it's written in the slide, this is another story. So I thank you very much, and sorry for having abuse of the time. Thank you.